Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our class on the life of David. We are in lesson 5 today, looking at 1 Samuel 21 and 22, the incident at Nob. David and the incident at Nob. So David has been on the run. Saul is doing everything he can to find and capture and kill David. It's all just out of jealousy and suspicion in Saul's heart. And so David comes and he arrives to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. And it says in verse 1 that Ahimelech came trembling to meet him. Uh, there's no surprise about what's going on with David. The whole nation must have known that David is heavily sought after by Saul, that he is the nation's number one most wanted. And here, out of the blue, all of a sudden appears David to this priest, and he's by himself. And so certainly the priest must have been suspicious. Why is he here? Is he really a troublemaker? Is he dangerous? Or is Saul going to be hot on his trail? Well, David comes, and what you see in this context is just how absolutely desperate David is. And so he says in verse 2, the king has commissioned me with a matter, and has said to me, let no one know anything about the matter in which I'm sending you, with which I have commissioned you. And I have directed the young men to a certain place. Now therefore, what you have on hand, give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever can be found. So David, he lies. He lies in order to get what he can, to be able to satisfy his needs and get on his way. And so he lies. Saul had not sent him on a mission. Saul and David are not speaking. And he asked for bread, and Ahimelech responds by saying the only bread they have on hand is the consecrated bread, the bread that was really only for priests. There's a detail given here about when David says that will do. The priest says, "Are your young men clean? Have they kept themselves from women?" And there's an expectation about the bread that the priest would eat. They had to continue and maintain a sense of purity and cleanliness because of their relationship and the service of God in close proximity to God. You can look at Leviticus 24 verse 9, or even what God says about Israel in the mountain of Sinai in Exodus 19 verse 15 about being clean before the Lord. The thing is, this whole section here, God's name is only found once in verse 6. And so here's David, a man after God's own heart, and he's lying. He's taking bread that really wasn't his to take. And he just knows that God's name is not on his lips. God's name is not mentioned. So the less time I spend praying, the less time I spend seeking God's will, the more likely I am to make these bad decisions, to sin. It really teaches us about the desperate down times of life. The times when we feel forced into a corner. Those are times when we are tempted to compromise on our convictions. Those are times when we're tempted to abandon the things that we know are true in order to either shake off an enemy, in order to appease an evil person in my life. When we're desperate, when we're hungry, when we're on the run, we can find ourselves making poor decisions. Well, Ahimelech provides for David and his men. He gives them in verse 6 the bread of the sanctuary. And then in verse 9, he offers this interesting detail. He says, the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you would take it for yourself, take it, for there's no other except it here. David said, there's none like it. Give it to me. David asked for bread, and he asked for weaponry, and it just so happens he takes with him the sword of Goliath. He knew that sword. He'd use that sword to cut off Goliath's head. But think about that there. David comes desperate, hungry, and defenseless, and he comes into this sanctuary, and Ahimelech provides bread, and he provides a sword. In many ways, is this not what we see in the purpose of the church? The church is called the pillar and support of truth in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 15. And so in many ways, as a local congregation and as a church, we provide bread. No, we don't provide physical bread to merely satisfy one's physical hunger, a hunger that will only return all too soon. No, we provide the spiritual bread, the bread of life, the spiritual nourishment through the teaching and preaching of the gospel, of the truth. And then in many ways, people come so defenseless. And they come without really having the right tools and equipment to defend and prepare against the spiritual battles. And we provide the sword. That is, no, not physical weaponry, not physical swords and shields, but the sword of the Spirit, providing the equipping of those who are in our midst to defend against the battles that they wage against Satan. And so the church welcomes those who are weary, and those who come leave stronger than how they came. They leave fed and equipped, ready to go out into battle. In fact, you notice how chapter 22 begins. It says, so David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam, and when his brothers and all his father's household heard of it, they went down to him there. Everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discouraged gathered to him, and he became captain over them. And there was about 400 men with him. And so David draws the outcast to him, those who were low, those who were unwanted, those who were desperate. They flocked to David, and David became their leader. And there's a point there that we tend to gather with people with whom we have like situations with. And that's another good thing about the church. And we come as we are. We come broken and weary and wounded, but we don't stay that way. We come to be taught, we come to be changed. We come leaving more and more like Jesus. Well, so from this, Saul, the king, hears about David being at Emelec, with Emelec. And he hears about this because of this man named Doeg. In chapter 21 and verse 7, one of the servants of Saul was there, almost like the spy, Doeg the Edomite. And so Doeg goes back and reports to Saul that he's been cared for by the priest of Ahimelech. And his response in chapter 22 and verse 14, verse 13. Saul says to Ahimelech, why have you and the son of Jesse conspired against me, and that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, so that he would rise up against me by lying in ambush as it is this day? He comes and confronts the priest about it. Why are you helping David? Why are you furthering this conspiracy? And Ahimelech answered the king and says, who among all your servants is as faithful as David, even the king's son-in-law, who is captain over your guard and is honored in your house? Did I just begin to inquire of God for him today? Far be it from me. Do not let the king impute anything to his servant or to any of the household of my father, for your servant knows nothing at all of this whole affair. And that's the thing. He says, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know about any conspiracy to take over the throne, Saul. But what I know is that this is not the first time I've prayed for David. I know about David. And I know about the good he has done and will continue to do. Don't hold this against me. Well, that's not how Saul responds. Because in verse 16 and 17, Ahimelech, the priest of God, is put to death because he has helped David. He is put to death because of Saul and the hardness and madness of his heart. What happens then is that David hears about it. And in verse 22 of chapter 22, David says to Abiathar. Abiathar is the son of Ahimelech. I'm looking here, verse 20. The son of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled to David. Verse 21, Abiathar told David that Saul killed the priest of the Lord. Then David said to Abiathar, I knew on that day, when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul, I have brought about the death of every person in your father's household. Stay with me, do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life seeks your life, for you are safe with me. So he knows that David, ultimately, he's not responsible. Ultimately, he is not responsible for Ahimelech's death. That was Saul. That was Saul and his evil and his madness and his rage, and Doeg for being the spy. So, no, ultimately, David is not responsible. But you see here, he takes full responsibility. He said, I knew it. I knew in seeing Doeg, knowing his relationship and association with Saul, I knew he would report. And I knew this would only end one way. It's just a lesson that we've got to learn, a lesson that we're trying to teach our kids to learn, and that is that our actions affect more than just ourselves. They do. Here, David's actions of going to the priest, of behaving the way he did, it caused harm. It brought about the death of everyone in there, Ahimelech and all those priests and all those who were serving. Everything we do affects another. Perhaps that's why Paul would give us the bold call in Philippians chapter 1 to live in a manner worthy of the gospel, because realize the way we live will affect those around us. But what David does then is that he takes Abiathar and he takes him under his care. Your father's dead. I'm taking full responsibility. You're going to be with me, and I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to make sure no one hurts you. This right was the right thing to do, but it doesn't make right the wrong that he did. It doesn't make what he did okay. It doesn't make it okay that he was, in some sense, responsible for the death of Ahimelech's or Abiathar's father. But David tries to make right, tries to do a right from here going forward. And that's a lesson that even though we've done wrong in the past, just doing right today doesn't make the wrong okay. But if we've done wrong, don't let that wrong keep us from doing right in the future. And that's what David does here. He doesn't do it to excuse his behavior. He doesn't do it to try and make amends for his behavior. He did wrong. He did wrong before Abiathar and before Ahimelech. But he's not going to let that one wrong keep him from doing right in the future. And so he cares for this young man. I want to end at a place apart from here. I want to end in the book of Matthew chapter 12, because Jesus will refer to this specific event in Matthew chapter 12. I'm going to be looking here in Matthew 12, beginning in verse 1. It says, "At that time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples became hungry and began to pick the heads of the grain and eat. But when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, 'Look, your disciples do what is not lawful to do on a Sabbath.' But he said to them, 'Have you not read what David did when he became hungry, he and his companions? How he entered the house of God and he ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for him to eat, not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but for the priests alone? Or have you not read in the law, in verse 5, that the Sabbath, the Sabbath, I'm sorry, let me start over. Have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and are innocent? But I say to you that something greater than the temple is here. But if you had known what this means, I desire compassion and not a sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man," in verse 8, "is the Lord of the Sabbath." So the Pharisees are upset at what they deem to be a breaking of the law. It was not the law that Jesus and his apostles broke. It was the tradition of the Pharisees. It was the Pharisaical rules, not God's law, that was formed the basis of their charge. It was not unlawful for the disciples to eat on the Sabbath, to pluck grain and eat from the field. Deuteronomy 23 and verse 25 teaches that. But the Pharisees contended that the actions of Jesus and his apostles, by picking the grain and eating it, constituted as work. So Jesus answers with four things. He enters with four arguments. Number one, he points out their inconsistency. He says, "Have you not read?" And he points back to 1 Samuel 21. David was hungry. David ate the bread that he was not permitted to eat. He did what was not lawful. And yet, far from criticizing David, the Pharisees respected him. If they excused David and his men for doing something that was unlawful because they were simply hungry, consistency would require them to excuse Jesus and his disciples on the same basis. Argument number two is that the Sabbath prohibition against work wasn't absolute for the priest. You see, the priests were blameless even though they worked in the temple on the Sabbath. They changed out the showbread. Leviticus chapter 24 and verse 8 shows that. They offered sacrifices on the Sabbath. Numbers 28, 8 and 9 and 10. And so if such service superseded the Sabbath law, it follows then that the ministry of the one who's greater than the tabernacle or greater than the temple would also take precedence over the Sabbath. Jesus claimed right here, verse 5 and verse 6, to be a greater embodiment of God's presence than the temple itself. Here's number three. Number three, from Scripture, they did not know the meaning of Hosea 6 and verse 6. Because if they did, they would not have condemned the innocent. Hosea declared that God's concern is with helping men. Mercy rather than honoring man-made rules. And so allowing the hungry to eat on the Sabbath was an act of compassion. A compassion that would have been consistent with God's will and God's heart. And then the last one, number 4, is that Christ is the Lord of the Sabbath. Lord is a claim to deity. It's a claim that asserts Christ's authority over the Sabbath. And so this meant that if anyone knew the Sabbath law, it was Jesus. I mean, Christ had instituted the Sabbath. And as Lord of it, he knew what the Sabbath law involved. And when it was violated, and when it was perverted. He would have known if pulling out those heads would have broken the Sabbath. And Christ came only to do the Father's will. He is not going to disobey or dishonor or to break the law of his Father. And so if anyone knew what really constituted a Sabbath law, it would have been Jesus. It's just fascinating that here, Jesus points back. He points back to a moment in David's life when David was desperate and David made the wrong choice. But rather than pointing to the error of David, the Pharisees would rather excuse David, who was guilty, than to excuse Jesus and the apostles for eating when they were hungry, even though they were innocent. And there's a point there. Don't be hypocritical. Don't be hypocritical in our judgment of others. Be fair. Be right. Seek compassion and mercy rather than a heart so full of criticism and judgment. That kind of a heart keeps us from seeing the good in others. We're allowing there to be any kind of grace or compassion towards others. Don't have that kind of a heart. But also from our study today, learn from David that in those moments when we are weak and we are weary and we're tired and we're hungry, those are times when Satan's going to hit. And we are going to feel the temptation to compromise on the things we know that we cannot compromise on our morals, on our convictions. Be strong in those moments. Surround yourself with godly people in those moments. And most importantly, lean on the Lord in those moments. Be ever more fervent in prayer in those moments. Open up your word even more in those moments, because it's in those moments we will be tested. And the strength of our faith will be determined. Will we trust in God when we need him the most in our weary moments? David didn't do right in this chapter, but he made a right decision in chapter 22. And as we're going to see, perhaps this moment was a test to him. It was something that helped him learn, a learning moment for him. Because in our next study, we're going to see David in just as desperate as a situation, but he demonstrates an amazing display of faith and courage and self-control. We'll study that next time. I thank you so much for studying with me today. If you've got some thoughts or comments, share them along. Send them on our message portion of our website, or send me an email. I'd love to hear from you and to see what you're learning as we're going through this section together. But thank you so much for studying with me. I look forward to us studying together again sometime soon. Have a wonderful day, and take care.